Hey, welcome to the City Rev Life podcast. I'm Pastor Robey, and today we have a very special guest, Pastor Alan Platt, with us. Alan, how you doing today?
It's a joy to be with you. What a delightful opportunity to be with City Rev. Love you guys.
Yes, we love Alan. You've probably heard him preach here. You've preached maybe 2 times here, Alan, 2 or 3 times?
2 times that I think I might have made sense.
Yes. The other times we just forget about.
Yes.
So Alan's been here for a couple times. We always love having Alan here. He is behind the scenes, though. Alan and his team have just deposited so much into City Rev, into our staff, into our culture, into our strategic framework. And a lot of that has to do with Doxa Deo, the church that Alan leads, that is really all over the world, and then also the City Changers movement. But let's just start with Doxa Deo, because I just want to make sure those who are watching and listening to the City Rev Life podcast have just a context for Doxa Deo, which is out of Pretoria, South Africa, but have spread. How many campuses in Pretoria?
14 campuses in Pretoria.
14 in Pretoria, which is one of the largest cities in South Africa.
It's the capital city, yes.
Capital city.
Yes.
And then how many other cities in South Africa?
And we're in 6 cities in total in South Africa.
Okay.
And then 3 cities outside of South Africa, which is London, Stuttgart, Germany, and Auckland, New Zealand.
That's awesome.
And it doesn't really make sense to people when they hear those cities, but there's a reason.
There's a reason. And part of that is the strategic thinking coming out of Doxa Deo and really your heart for cities and seeing and reaching cities around the world.
Yeah, we had a very distinct challenge after being part of the church for 2 years, seeing incredible growth and being very grateful for the fact that we were growing a good, healthy church. And then experiencing one day God challenge us to recognize that we are not a church for the church, but a church for the community. Mm-hmm. And that was in 1996, and that set us on a trajectory of discovering what does it mean for the church to truly play a role within the context of its world.
You know, just if you're watching, the heart Doxa Deo has for not just being a church for the church, but being a church for its community, for its city. That is one of the primary reasons we as City Rev have just drawn close to the Doxa Deo guys. And they, for the last more than 2 decades have been faithfully doing that, so we can actually just see what does it look like long term. And so Alan's so grateful for that just leadership, the example, the model that Doxa Deo is for us at City Rev, and then also the City Changers movement that is doing so many things on continents all over the world, convening churches, stirring up the unity process. Alan was instrumental in one of the key architects of Church United here in South Florida. Can you just speak real quick? We got to get into the topic at hand, but can you just speak real quick how Church United, the framework here in South Florida, how that's being amplified to the rest of the world in some cases?
Right. Well, we, about 10 years ago, recognized that, it would be helpful if we created a platform for dialogue with leaders, particularly church leaders, to help them to better understand how to position their faith community, their church, as a missional community. And of course, because our role personally had changed, not leading a local context anymore, but now playing a role within this broader engagement, in 2015, we became part of the fabric of the social engagement here in Florida by virtue of becoming part of the Calvary Chapel journey in their transition. And it was in that time that we were then asked if we could play a role to help form what is now Church United. And so now, as we engage with leaders all across the globe, and it's literally, just yesterday we had 9 nations of Europe on a Zoom call where they are running learning communities in their nations through the City Changes process. But we have learned so much here in the South Florida Church United journey. And we've extracted so many of those principles and now sharing them with those people all over the world. As a matter of fact, some of them even took our video for Church United that is South Florida referenced and repopulated it with local content and now showing that all over Europe. So very exciting.
Oh my goodness, I love hearing that. And it's just a reminder for us as a church, as we are pursuing seeing South Florida transformed by the power of the gospel in our generation, as partnering with other churches in South Florida, that has influence on what's happening way beyond just our city and around the world. So one of the things I love about spending time with Alan is, Alan, really, you truly have a global perspective because you're networking regularly with other leaders around the world, other church leaders around the world. And so specifically, we wanted to today talk about the conversation here in our country about racial justice, social equality, and not only just coming from a global perspective, Alan, but also just as someone from South Africa, walking through the era of apartheid, and just really wanted to share that perspective and to hear that perspective because as we've spoken, that has it's created a framework to look at what's happening here in our country. That's helpful. It's just helpful to get an outside perspective of what's happening inside our country. And now the City Changers movement, one of the main headquarters where Alan and part members of his team are out of is here in South Florida. And so he's been up close and personal watching what's been transpiring in our country. So maybe before we jump into that, Alan, it might be helpful to just give us a quick history of apartheid, what happened in South Africa. You're basically going to represent the entire nation of South Africa as its historian to us. I mean, anything you say, we're just going to take and believe. So no pressure, but maybe you can just give us an overview of just kind of what transpired historically and how that played out.
Well, I can tell you my own story. I grew up in South Africa as a child of 15 generations of European engagement within the nation. And so in essence, we grew up thinking that we truly are African. When we grew up, I say this to many people, it's difficult to explain, but we never really understood that there was any challenge between black and white in our nation. As a matter of fact, growing up as a young teenager, I was far more aware of the tensions between the Afrikaans-speaking community that was from Dutch descent and the English-speaking community that represented the British engagement in what was called the Boer War, where the British came in and really were brutal towards these settlers, these Dutch settlers, creating concentration camps, the scorched earth policy, burning their lands, and it was really a bad experience. And so a lot of the residue of that was still prevalent when I was growing up.
So when was that war?
It was towards just before the turn of the century, 1800 to 1900.
So late 19th century was the war. And then, but, generation or two later, there's still tension.
There's still tension very deeply because some of the grandparents that were alive were actually part of that experience. And so we were unaware. And that's perhaps the first thing that I could introduce as a concept that you might want to engage with. We can very easily, because of our own reality, be unaware of some real deep issues within the context of a nation. I was 21 years old when I first heard the name Nelson Mandela, or registered, in essence, that this was an important figure, politically speaking, within the context of our nation. Because I grew up in a very apolitical home, strong Christian environment, and obviously, being a Christian in the South African context at that stage, maybe just to say, we thought we really were. We knew the US was strong Christian, but we thought we were the real final bastion of Christianity in the world. I mean...
which is a hallmark. I mean, superiority is a hallmark of strong Christianity, just to say.
Oh, my goodness. And here's what was really the maybe sad and challenging part, is we had instituted as a national framework of political functioning what is called apartheid. Apartheid really just is apart. It means separation, in essence. And of course, people later then said it's apartheid.
Oh, wow.
But it's the way it's expressed in the Afrikaans language.
So maybe just a question there. So we have a framework in our country for segregation. So maybe just speak to, like, when you're talking about, when we hear apartheid, what exactly was was literally happening that maybe if you were in an Afrikaner home you would not be aware of?
Well, South Africa is a little more complex, because it's not just the fact that there are race differentiations, but also tribal differentiations. And so what you had in South Africa is different tribes. Even today, we have 11 official languages in the country. Just shows you the complexity. And so the idea was that a little Europe would be created within South Africa. That was the origin of the idea that different tribes, in essence, ethnic constituencies would govern themselves and run themselves, but we would be part of a united kind of framework. The only problem was that the cities were then kept for the then colonizers that came in, and so that was a white-only environment in the sense that only the whites could have property and certain rights to business. And the labor force would actually then come from some of the other tribal support. And, well, that created a whole social construct that was very, very challenging. You would find around every city shanty towns that were set up as transitional housing for the labor force that came in. Obviously, you can just imagine all the social problems that were created by that. But we thought that's the way it should be. And here's one of the things that reinforced that. In most of the mainline churches, the church reinforced this as the narrative of God's will and God's intent. It was from Scripture, it was produced to us that this is the way God wanted it. He wanted boundaries. He wanted different ethnic groups to be separated. And this is the weird thing, you know, you can prove actually anything from the Bible if you really want to do that. And so we grew up thinking, well, this is the way God wants it. This is the way everybody's happy about it. And it's just these few fringe elements that were voices, and we saw them as people that were not acceptable in the mainstream engagement. These were people like Desmond Tutu, who today is celebrated. He was challenging this narrative, and Well, we saw him as, a liberal theologian, as part of the social gospel, the liberation gospel, even so far as to identify him as a communist working for that regime, trying to destroy our Christian heritage. It was very convoluted. And that what makes it very difficult when you are in the midst of that to truly understand what was really at the heart of the issue that we wanted to address. Because you were part of that conversation, that dialogue, that conviction, strongly controlled by people of influence and people that you respected. We were controlling our conversation at that stage. It was only later that we came to the awareness there might be something wrong here.
So do you remember that, Alan? So you're growing up in that. It's strongly reinforced spiritually and in the church. You said you're 21 when you first, consciously remember Nelson Mandela. What was your initial? Did you initially put him in the category with, like, where Bishop Tutu was? Did you initially put him in that category as well, or?
Well, it's fair to say he was seen to be the ultimate criminal because he did go to jail because of his engagement in what was a call to arms against the current establishment. And so initially, and many people don't know this about Nelson Mandela, he was not like Martin Luther King, who consistently was for peaceful revolution. Mandela opted for a taking up of arms. And so a lot of the bombing that was happening in railway stations, in restaurants, in places where people had congregated, people died, was under his initiative. And so even when he came out of prison, he had not yet publicly recused from the armed struggle, as they used to call it. And so there was a lot of uncertainty as to where all of this would go. But somewhere along the line, he had this Damascus moment where he recognized it's time for reconciliation. And that, of course, changed just the whole nation into suddenly recognizing the possibilities and hope. I think what was important, perhaps for this conversation, Robey, is that as bad as those moments of protest and of damage that it caused was, it was as if that was the only thing that could snap us out of our being unaware there is a problem. And so it was in that crisis moment that we actually became aware. There is a problem. There is a people group that feel deeply, deeply hurt and within the context of legislation are being deeply affected. And suddenly me as a young pastor at that stage, I was just wrapping up my theological studies. And by the way, none of this was actually presented to me as I was studying. So my evangelical orientation, even theologically, never went into a dialogue of social realities and the construct of our world. And that's why I just want to commend you as a church. Thank you for City Rev, stepping into this conversation and stepping into this very uncomfortable and sometimes very challenging conversation where we don't have all the answers. But at least you're you're taking up that responsibility. And we, from the outside looking in, are very proud that here is a church that is actually doing that.
Well, thank you for those words, Alan. And I think a lot of what you're saying resonates. It's helpful to hear kind of the journey in another context, because we can approach that without kind of as much of the emotional weight as we have into our context that every one of us approach. And so appreciate you sharing that. Could you just walk us through, what was it like for you? You're already a pastor, and now you've been raised in a strong Christian home, in a church, you've had theological education, and those things have not led you to the awareness that you eventually came to. So then what was that process like for you, both spiritually, emotionally, relationally? Like, what was that like for that step one you said of like actually becoming aware? Wait a minute, this isn't just a fringe, liberal, or theologically dangerous group. There is a reality here that I need to square up to as a Bible-believing, gospel-centered, Jesus-loving Christian. What was that awareness process? How did you feel? What did you process through? Maybe walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it was an incredible journey. You have to understand, I was part of the privileged community. And we were highly privileged. We didn't realize, we just thought that was the way it was. At that stage, South Africa, when I grew up as a kid, South Africa was a very prosperous country. We were the biggest supplier of gold and diamonds in the world. And that was the greatest commodity before oil. So you can just imagine we had a good life. And so growing up in that context and suddenly now realizing that, if things change, what are the consequences? What are the implications that if we had to go into a new democratic order where everybody had a vote, what would that mean for our constituency? And that led us to what we would, refer to now as the whatabouts. And the whataboutism, it was very real, and some of it very legitimate, because we would ask, but what about this? What about that? What about... And we had some references that we could look at, because when we looked at Africa, we recognized there were elements there that were threatening what we had experienced in terms of our lifestyle, our values, the way we functioned. And so, obviously, that became the primary conversation, the what about? And suddenly you were confronted with these two components. So, is my allegiance going to go to the what about rather than address the real issue that we needed to address? And I think that we were confronted with that and recognized that the whatabouts are not necessarily helpful when you want to address the real issue. And some of that, I think, is true in any transition or any moment when you are confronted with a particular reality. I'm even hearing that within the conversation here. And so some of that experience for me, Robey, is in a way something of a deja vu, where I hear the same conversation, the same engagement. And my only encouragement to us is, there are times where we have to do the right thing. And the right thing is not always the convenient path, but it is the higher road. And this was where we, as South African people, were challenged. recognizing that we have to make this decision. And what is important to know is that this was taken to a referendum. In essence, this small percentage, 8% of the population, was white, controlling the meta-narrative in the nation, recognizing that if they give the go-ahead in the referendum to go and design a new constitution, which will be a one-man, one-vote system, in essence, everybody knew the implications. But the amazing thing is that they did have the referendum. It was a majority that gave the mandate to go and establish a whole new order. And in some way, there are many other dimensions, and I think I'd love to introduce that too. The church played a vital role in that transition process, recognizing that what we had cannot be sustained. The church needed to have a voice, and actually a bloodbath in our nation was averted because the church rose in that moment to make a difference.
Okay, all right. We definitely we need to talk about that. Before we go down that road, though, can we just back up for a second to the whatabouts? So you're talking about there's an awareness, and then once the awareness and a lot of, and what you spoke about was if a lot of the protest, a lot of the of those things hadn't happened, it wouldn't have shaken that awareness. And then you're speaking about the whatabouts. When you say whatabouts, are you saying where people are saying, okay, you're saying this, but what about this outlier situation that, you know, seems to speak against this? Or what about how, like when you say whatabouts, are you talking about the consequences? What is in essence are the whatabouts?
Well, you know, consequences for sure, but it was also a diversion on many levels, because it's easy to want to not address this so that we can address something else that we feel is a social ill.
Okay.
For one, it would be typically, in the South African context, tribes were attacking tribes. They hated each other.
Okay.
And so that would be a what about? But look at what's happening here. And similarly, we would say, what about black on black violence or those kind of conversations? And the moment we go there, it kind of brings a convoluted understanding of what is the real issue that we're actually trying to address here. This is legitimate. It needs to be addressed. But it should not be the diversion for us to address this.
Wow. Okay. You're saying the whatabouts are real issues, but they're issues that divert away from talking about the one that's presently. So like, for example, one that I've heard is we're talking about social justice, and I've heard it brought up, well, what about abortion?
Right.
And it's like, well, that is definitely an issue we need to talk about.
Right.
We've got to defend the vulnerable, defend life in the womb. But and let's talk about that. But let's not divert from this actual issue over here.
Right.
Divert it into what you're categorizing as a what about. Would that be a fair parallel?
Yes, and I think the last remark on that, perhaps, Robey, is that people sometimes don't realize the moment in history to address particular issues.
Okay.
And so what happens is they're saying, but you're talking about this, but you're not talking about this, and you're not talking about this. And it somehow becomes very difficult because they want you to have social commentary on every issue at the same time. Whereas perhaps this is the issue now that needs our attention so that we can deeply address this. Does not mean we're not going to talk about this. But it's that tension that we sometimes find ourselves in. And the moment you kind of cluster all of this together, you know, it just dissipates. and we have no influence.
It's true. And so for example, the weekend, we experienced that just recently. The weekend we addressed what was going on with racial equality and social justice. We addressed that. The weekend we addressed it. We had actually been planning for weeks to talk with the president of an organization that stands for pro-life here in our city, and about a week before they had to cancel, so we were going to reschedule it, and then we saw how it seemed providential because the Lord had another issue that we also need to address that weekend, and so you talked about awareness. Then the whatabouts, and then you talked about the role the church played. Can you speak to that? The role the church played and it seems like it helped the country avoid some significant violence.
The church did play a vital role. If it had not been that the church showed up the way it did, I think the outcome might have looked very, very different. But it's interesting to see not only did the church play a role in the run-up to this new dispensation, the church also played a role after the new democratic order was established. They went into a season that was actually initiated by Nelson Mandela, what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So Nelson Mandela came to the church and said, I want a place, a platform, where people could come and share what they have done as atrocities that were race-based. And if they shared honestly, putting all the facts on the table, then they would qualify for absolute amnesty. They would not be prosecuted ever. And in most of those cases, they should do this confession in the presence of the victims.
Unbelievable.
Now, you can imagine, how this played a role in the psyche of our nation, because what happened is they started capturing these confessions and moments of reconciliation led by Bishop Tutu and a bunch of church leaders. And these moments of restitution were captured then on video, and every Sunday night for an hour there was a program that shared these stories with the nation. It wrecked us. We were watching those stories saying we never realized, we didn't know, it was impossible. Did this really happen? But that sparked something within the context of the church, where we realized it's not good enough just to listen to the stories. We actually now have to practically action to publicly show our sense of wanting to see reconciliation and repentance and just recognition of one another in that particular season.
That's unbelievable. So the church oversaw public, and it was captured on TV for the nation to watch.
Right.
Public confession of a race-based atrocity that someone did. If they confessed it, then they would get basically pardoned.
Right.
And then the entire nation watched. So someone would confess this in front of the entire nation. That had to have done just something for the soul of the nation to just find brokenness and repentance.
It was amazing. It ignited a journey for us as church leaders where we said, how could we manifest this publicly? And the best way we could think of was, why don't we just create enough moments where we publicly would wash the feet of other church leaders from other races and ethnicities. I washed more feet in those 2 years than I think I could count, because
You're talking literally, not metaphorically.
literally, we had these moments where in public spaces we would have integrated gatherings, which was at that stage totally new, because you weren't allowed to have integrated engagements in the height of apartheid. Of course, towards the latter years, that started changing. But so here we were with integrated engagement, and publicly we would have church leaders from different ethnicities come to the stage, and we would start washing feet. And I mean, it was symbolic of something that was happening in the hearts of people all across the nation. It was one of the most beautiful seasons, and all I can say is it created such a moment of hope in the hearts of our people and of the nation. It was a wonderful, wonderful moment. At times, I think if only we had recognized how important that was, and we kind of got to a point, I think, in the church where we thought, now we've done it. And we kind of accepted that, this whole race thing is now done and dusted. And unfortunately, over the years now, we've seen how fringe elements, both right and left, have once again emerged and created new tensions within the context of our society. And the challenge, I think, is consistently to the church is don't lose sight of the important role that you play within this context.
Would it be fair to say, Alan, that one of the most healthy things that happened in that era was the church took leadership, but the looking back, what could have been helpful was the church staying in that role of leadership to continue to pursue racial equality and justice. Is that fair?
I think very fair to say, and I think that's exactly where we are. But one remark I think that must be very important. When we say the church took leadership, in essence, the church did not rise up with a political agenda, with arrogance, with a posture where the tone was, we're positioning our dogmatic convictions. It came with great humility. The church took leadership with a towel. It was a very different heart that was manifested. And that gave some incredible moral authority at that time. Whereas prior to that, the church might have approached it very strongly from a dogmatic, positional, conviction level, kind of meeting flesh with flesh. But this was the opposite spirit. This was coming with love where there was hatred. There's forgiveness where there's bitterness. There's laying our lives down where there's self-centeredness, where the agendas were so strong, and they were extremely strong. The church came in with this sense of just humility, brokenness, love. There's so much power in that posture, and we saw it. That's what gave the church its authority. Even the politicians would recognize and adhere and accept what the church was suggesting, because they were addressing it not from a political or a party political, for sure not, vantage point. It was from a vantage point of love and humanity and just a recognition of our inabilities to reconcile some of the very big distances that there were. And I think that's where the power lay.
Wow. Well, Alan, thank you so much for sharing that journey, and a lot to glean from that for us. The role the church plays, the role of humility, the importance of awareness. So many things that you've said to me. There's some ways that our journey here in the States has felt like deja vu. There's some cues. Obviously, there's always differences, but so much that we can glean from how the Church of South Africa led in that era, and how we can walk forward in this season. Well, hey, Alan, thank you for joining us on this episode of City Rev Life podcast. Always a joy having you here, my friend.
Thank you so much. God bless each one of you.
Hey, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time on the City Rev Life podcast.
Thank you for joining us on City Rev Life. You can subscribe to this podcast, rate and review wherever you're listening to this. And we love it when you share it with your friends on social media. For more videos and content, go ahead and check us out at cityrev.org/podcast or download our City Rev Church app. Have a great day.